This video is on trauma awareness for facilitators, particularly embodiment facilitators, but it'll be useful for trainers and coaches of all kinds. So what I'm gonna share in this video is a little bit about what trauma is, a little bit about how it turns up in training and coaching, and a little bit maybe about some of the other treatments and things that are out there. So a little bit about myself. So what's my qualification for this? My main mentor, Paul Linden, is a trauma therapist. Well, he's called himself a trauma educator. He's been working with abuse recovery his whole life. I've done a 10-year apprenticeship with him, bits of other training in various other trauma modalities. I've worked extensively with resilience training for humanitarian aid workers, and that I've trained with some of the major humanitarian aid workers in the organizations in the world, like, I don't know, Oxfam, Save the Children, War Child, various people, UN, and I've also been deployed around the world in about 7 different or 8 areas of conflict. So I've been to Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Middle East, East Africa, slums of Brazil, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this subject is really important in that it really affects how people learn. So just for any trainers and facilitators, it's important, but also it's really affecting the body. So for my students who are embodied coaches and trainers, extra important. All right, so what is trauma? So there's lots of perspectives on this. Trauma is caused by overwhelming experiences. This is the key thing, overwhelming. Sometimes in psychology, it's threat to life or limb or integrity of self. So it's a bit unusual in that the actual stimulus itself is part of, what counts, as it were, as trauma. There's other people, though, these days that are more talking about like nervous system dysregulation, talking about trauma in a much broader sense of little traumas. I have some concerns about the word spreading, you know, like I was traumatized if there was no chocolate, and I'm like, do you mean upset? Do you mean angry? Yeah. So, however, I think it's worth reserving this word trauma for serious crap that happens to people. What is it? Well, we could say there's an acute and a chronic trauma response. So if you think of just the basic fight, flight, freeze response, that would be that acute response that just lasts a bit longer. And chronic would be that's in some way stuck in the system beyond a few days, maybe even into the weeks, months, years. That response is not just naturally fading. I'll give you an example of fading. So I was in a car accident about 10 years, 12 years back, and I really felt like I had like 10 espressos afterwards. I couldn't sleep for a day or two. My heart was racing. I was super buzzy. I was actually quite enjoying it in some ways. It was like, whoa, I'm alive, yeah? And then after a couple of days, I just crashed, went to sleep for 12 hours, didn't have that hyperarousal symptom, and returned basically to normal. I don't think I had any long-term trauma from that car accident. Actually, some people say, for example, even something really severe like rape, only 50% of people who are raped develop PTSD. I would say most would develop some symptoms long-term, but to be post-traumatic stress disorder has to have a number of symptoms that are there. And there's other symptoms like generalized anxiety disorder that are collections of trauma symptoms to be diagnosed. All right, so different potential symptoms there. So there's the hyperarousal stuff. That might be like alertness, anxiety, not sleeping, quickness to anger, that, hypervigilance, that being on edge. Yeah, that being wired. Sometimes there's whole countries have that. Like when I'm in Israel, it feels like the whole country has that. All right, as almost like a cultural trauma symptom. So there's the hyperarousal, there's the numbing symptoms. So numbing symptoms would be not feeling, like the Russian not smiling, not being able to connect, having relational problems as a result. Numbing can also be a strategy of coping, like people drinking or drugging or doing other addictive behaviors as a sort of strategy for reducing that hyperarousal. Or it can be that feeling disconnected from life, feeling like life has no meaning would be another kind of numbing. You see that in sort of burnout related trauma. And then there's the reliving symptoms. So that might be like a full-blown flashback. This is kind of a cliche. Far more common than that is just thinking about something a lot. I remember after they had some experiences in Brazil that weren't very pleasant in the slums, and it was just on my mind a lot for about 6 months afterwards. So at that point, it's looking like a trauma as opposed to, simply like I was thinking about what happened yesterday because it was significant, yeah? Intrusive thoughts would be another one on the reliving front. So 3 sets of symptoms that are part of PTSD. The thing with trauma is it can affect everything. And I do like this frame of it kind of changing our nervous system. Getting us stuck in fight or flight or freeze is a key thing, or fold, the collapse response. So let's look at how that might affect training generally. So it might be inability to trust. So if you think of like deep training work, it happens through trust. And often say like Russia, for example, which is a pretty traumatized culture because of their history, is very low trust. And you'll see this with people like being wary of you. And as a coach or as a therapist, that's really interesting, right? And that can be quite, you might have to go a lot slower in certain things. It could be wanting certainty, because what's been lost in trauma is a sense of safety. So what produces that might be like groups getting to know each other, but also like telling people what's happening. So one of the things I like to do, and I think I did it at the beginning of this video, is say, here's what's coming up. Yeah, here's the schedule for today, here's what we're going to be up to today, here's what to expect. So it's important with children too, actually, but there can be that sense of like, okay, I can control my world a bit if I know what's coming. And with traumatized people, that's even more necessary. Okay, what else are you going to see as a trainer? There could be different relationship to authority, either wanting to be close to authority or being very wary of authority. If someone in power, like a parent or a boss, has in some way hurt someone, there can be the different relationship to authority, a teenage pushback. You'll see acquisitive strategies like safety, I have to get everything, I have to take notes about everything. That's one I've seen quite a lot in Russia again. You'll see this sort of arguing kind of fightiness, like Israelis will argue about everything in a training. And again, it's partly cultural, but I think it's a trauma pattern, that constant arguing with the teacher. And at first I used to think it was sort of disrespectful. And now I go, okay, it seems like a cultural pattern, a trauma pattern, that's how they learn. You want to fight? Okay, we can, you know, they have this game in Israel called matkot, where you're bashing a ball backwards and forwards. It's like bat, 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 bat. It's a bit like that. And I just go, okay, well, that seems to be the pattern here in terms of the trauma. Key thing is helping people feel safe, helping people feel at ease, helping people feel connected. So for transformational learning, the social engagement system and the fight-flight system are incompatible. That means people won't trust or won't get intimate with self and other. We'll come back to that in a minute. If they've got that fight-flight response permanently engaged. However, by helping people connect, that might be looking around the group, giving people time to talk to each other, letting people introduce themselves and each other. That helps establish this social connection and therefore a sense of safety again. I think choice is also massively important in the trauma is disempowering. So by saying to people, hey, if you want to miss a session and rest, that's fine. If you don't want to, you know, in embodiment, this is absolutely mandatory. It's like mandatory to have choice. Interesting paradox. It's certainly something I encourage with students, that you say, listen, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. Yeah. So people can feel empowered to have choice. What you have to be careful of as well, people that have been abused in different ways, is they can be people pleasing. I'll look at them and say, who can have a volunteer? And they feel like they should volunteer. Or there can be that sense of you have to do what the person in power wants. And people who have been abused can be very, very sensitive at picking up on what they think you want. And even like a slight tone of voice can almost like cajole them into it. So there has to be that, I give people that get out clause of, you know, if you don't want to do it, that's fine. It's really important when someone does say rest or step out of an exercise, that you support that. This is when everyone else will feel safe and free. It's about feeling free, basically. Is when someone steps out and say, oh, okay, no problem. I'll ask one of the room team to join in to pair up. Or, yeah, no problem, just make a 3 over there. All right, so you really support that and actually positively reinforce it. So I saw someone take a rest earlier, that was brilliant. You don't have to, you know, single them out, and then the whole group goes, oh, he really means it. We really do have a choice. It's not just lip service, yeah? So choice we've talked about, some sense of agency, giving people that adult responsibility, but also some predictability, some guidance, not punishing people. So establishing social connections, trust, safety. This is just good training, actually. If you're doing transformational work, trauma sensitive is just good deep training. There's no contradiction between those things, because it's just a slightly more extreme version of a normal pattern that people need to open up and feel safe and learn. Yeah. to get into kind of play mode and learning mode as opposed to reactivity mode, defensiveness mode, yeah? So just good training. Embodiment in particular, so the body can be an unsafe place for people who have been traumatized. So making sure people have that choice. A really big one on EFC is not just touching people without permission. You're asserting people's right to their own bodily boundaries, which may have been violated, so they may over or under defend them. Yeah, over under defending of boundaries of different kinds will crop up with traumatized people generally on training, whether that's going along with things or being over defensive about things. But with the body particularly, we're not touching without that permission, being aware of gendered issues, ethnic kind of differences, being aware of different cultural backgrounds. You know, if someone's from a Jewish background or a Russian background or an Irish background, you know, there's going to be different. Oh, the stuff around food can come up on courses as well if people have that in their cultural trauma, like Irish and Russians and Polish and quite a few other countries. You'll see a scarcity around food, or like really wanting to know that there is food on retreat, and they can get enough food, and they can get into the fridge, and they can bring their own food, and whatever issues they've picked up. So food can bring out a lot of this stuff. Yeah, so I think helping people feel safe around that stuff, establishing boundaries, having ground rules around touch, around you know, sexual activity. You know, we'll be very clear that there isn't sexual activity between staff and students. That's absolutely not allowed. So there's a kind of clear line there. So people are really, really clear that they're not going to be kind of predated upon sexually, which is sadly the norm in some, say, martial arts or even some meditation schools. That becomes norm, and yeah, not cool ethically. And in terms of people from trauma backgrounds around those sort of things, really, really important. Some activities I might say, you know, women might want to do this with other women or men with other men. Again, that can help establish that feeling of safety if there's particular things. And that might be sensitive things, but it also might be like aggressive things. I've seen guys, for example, when we do like pad work, hitting pads or martial arts work, they like really want to go with other guys. And I can, it feels like that's coming from a traumatized place sometimes, or a fear of their own aggression. So yeah, again, making opportunities for that. You know, we've experimented with having gendered spaces on courses, which is quite interesting too. Yeah, so the boundary stuff, the touch stuff, calibration. Oh my God, consent and calibration and capacity. These are the big three. So get those in your head if you're an EFC student. Consent, calibration, capacity. Consent I've talked about a lot, having opt-outs. Opt-ins really are better than opt-outs, I would say. So it's not like, put your hand up if you don't want this. It's like, okay, if you want to do this exercise, stand up now, come over here. An opt-in rather than an opt-out. Calibration is you're not doing too much too quick, because trauma comes from overwhelm. Therefore, how do you not overwhelm people? You let them build up gradually. And titrate, they call it in some trauma systems. Yeah, so this would, for example, teaching centering. You don't start off with a grab, you work up from tissue throwing. You look at the centering videos and the centering training on EFC. You give people sequences. You don't throw people in at the deep end. You let them start gently and work their way up and stop before they get overwhelmed. So when they're in that fight or flight, or the lower end of it, the subtlest end of it you can find, this is the calibration. This is a safety thing. It's a massive part of when we teach centering. But for anything, I'm always looking at a group and going, is this too much? Am I getting near too much? Am I starting to see people freeze, space out? That's one to watch out for, the dissociation, as well as the fight-flight response. Freeze and dissociation are, in a way, two of the harder ones to spot. Fight or flight is normally obvious, but freeze, they don't move, or they just stop being able to answer questions. At that point, you've lost capacity. So if people are too tired, too hungry, too full mentally, yeah, if they're drunk or mentally ill, but you know, there's various versions of that. But just on a training, it's normally just a full up. I give them rests. I'm increasingly giving rests. I used to push people way too hard. Now I go, you know what, that's not kind, it's not smart. They're hitting capacity. They're getting to a point where like, what? They're spacing out. They're not answering questions. They're sort of dragging their feet when they stand up for an exercise. I go, time for a rest. Nervous system needs to integrate learning, particularly with traumatized people, particularly if you're doing full-on emotional work. All right, next bits, referring, limits of expertise. Assuming you're not a trauma therapist, I know quite a bit about trauma, but I'm not a therapist, so I refer to therapists. If you're working with the body as an embodiment teacher, you need to do your own trauma work. If you don't, you will be triggered, you will be numb when you don't need to be numb, you'd be too hyper-aroused when that's not helpful to clients. You need to do your own trauma work if you're going to get into the body, because it's a barrier. Trauma is a toxic barrier to embodiment. So if you're training on EFC, most years we highly recommend people do some certain individuals be spotted by the teachers, spotted by the trauma therapists that work with us, and they'll say we highly advise you go get some trauma therapy. There's good stuff out there, somatic experiencing, EMDR. Some people like TRE, some people like the tapping. Different things work for different people. So I don't just want to say one method fits all. Some people it's body work. There's different things out there. Gestalt, Hakomi's very good. Different modalities that I know have worked in at least some cases for myself or others. And I've been through this myself. So I got PTSD from working in war zones. So there's no judgment for me if I do refer someone. I've done that work myself. And actually you do it on levels as well. As you go deeper into the body or deeper into meditation as well, my experience is there's like the hygiene level, can't function in the world level. There's another layer that you need to work with other people. So you could be kind of, I met a veteran the other day who was a bit wired and a bit numb and self-medicating on lots of marijuana. He was sort of basically life functional, but I wouldn't recommend he coach anyone. Yes, there's like another layer. And the third layer is like this deepest, very subtle, refined layer. That's personally what I'm working with now with craniosacral work, where it's like, okay, I feel like I'm assessed by competent people and able to work with others, but there's a subtler layer. So I would say for most of us, there's something we can do. For some EFC students, we make this mandatory before we'll qualify them if we see it they're at that upper layer that needs work. And, not everyone's traumatized either. I don't want to like overstate. This has become a bit of a fashion almost. It's almost like we've gone from trauma unaware, trauma ignorant to sort of trauma neurotic, trauma oversensitive. We can still assume robustness as long as we know the limits of our expertise. Often EFC students are a bit worried, like, what if trauma comes up? And it's like, stabilize people, use centering techniques, use the Paul Linden bowling ball technique, which will teach you. You stabilize students, and then you refer them. So I like to have the number, I always do in any country I'm working with, a male and female teacher of 2 different modalities, 2 different genders on my phone that I can refer people to. People will disclose as well. Like I've had people come up to me at the end of EYP workshops. We've been doing no posture, working with boundaries, and someone's come up to me afterwards and said, I was raped, I've never told anyone, what do I do? Yeah, and at that point, it's like knowing the number of a support service is useful. Addiction is another one people disclose to me a lot as someone that's quite public about being in recovery. Yeah, you'll get those. So the main thing is you've done enough work yourself that you can be stable when that happens, empathize with the person, not give advice, and refer to the services and professionals that exist. So unless you are a therapist or whatever, you're not giving advice, you're not telling people what to do, and you're robust enough yourself as a trainer that it doesn't freak you out. Yeah, so if someone comes to me and says, I was abused as a child, do I feel sad? Yes. Would I want that for anyone? Of course not. It's horrible. And I can actually stand there and talk to them and have a normal conversation. I'm not making it weird for them. I'm not making it worse for them. I'm saying, you know what, I do hear this quite often, very sadly. Here's, some services you can go to. Do you have a therapist? Would you like one? Do you know about the support groups that exist? Someone comes up to me and talks about drug addiction. I might tell them about NA or CA, different organizations that are out there. And I let people know they're not alone and there's hope. I remember one time I was working with soldiers in Ukraine. It was just a few days before my wedding there, actually. And they looked desperate. And I just started to say, look, here are the symptoms. Wasn't trying to treat them. I said, here are the symptoms. And they went, I have that. I can't sleep. I have that. I have that flashback, whatever. And then I said, and here are some possibilities. And here are some local numbers and some Ukrainian therapists who work with the military here that I'd been given ahead of time. And the people were looking at me like at the end, like shaking my hand and saying in Russian and Ukrainian, thank you so much. just because I'd kind of told them it was possible to get treatment and there was people out there that could help. So if you can pass that message on in a way that's empathic, then great, but knowing when to refer. What else? It's a big subject, and I kind of feel like I've jumped around a bit here. I hope this has been useful. Being aware that people may be hypersensitive or numb in an embodied context. So people may be like, this window of tolerance, they call it, is a useful concept. So it's like feeling nothing, whoa, totally overwhelmed. That window of this is where you have to calibrate carefully. With normal people, it's like nothing, a bit, more, too much, overwhelmed, right? So you've got a bit more leeway, whereas traumatized people, you have to be very sensitive and calibrate in a small way, which I'd say is just good best practice anyway for everyone. But that's kind of why. I mean, you just don't know who's traumatized. There's some statistics, well, there's one statistic like 80% of people in the UK have a traumatic incident in their life, and that's in the UK, let alone, you know, Afghanistan or somewhere. Some people say 1 in 6 women or 1 in 6 men and 1 in 4 women have been sexually abused. I think those figures are actually overstated. However, it's a significant portion of people. I would put it this way: if you have a class of 20 people in your training group, you should assume that at least 1 or 2 of them have been raped or sexually abused. Yeah, and you should assume that 1 or 2 of them have been physically assaulted, even in a very safe place like Brighton, where I live, that's not got high crime rates. That is a fair assumption. You should assume that 1 or 2 of them have a drug addiction currently or in the past, yeah, or alcohol addiction. Make that assumption in a normal sized group. There'll be 1 or 2 people, and it just brings like a bit of care. I make a lot of jokes when I'm training, and I'm not politically correct, so I'm not saying you should walk on eggshells, but bringing that little bit of care and that awareness that these things are common, that these things are maybe more common than you think, can bring a sensitivity to how you approach boundaries, how you approach calibration, how you approach, you know, the capacity stuff if people are overwhelmed and tired, how you talk about the day ahead, how you look at food, how you look at scarcity stuff when people are worried about missing things. There's a few thoughts. I've got loads of videos on this subject, really recommending people like Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, people like Peter Levine. Peter Levine's got a really small, accessible introduction to trauma book, and then he's got, I forget the name of it, it's something trauma. The cheapest one you'll find on Amazon. And then he's got Waking the Tiger, which is a bit bigger and a bit more of a classic. David Bocelli from TRE's written some stuff. Judith Herman. There's a bunch of people out there now. These guys, Stephen Porges, of course, great speaker, loads of TED Talks, loads of free stuff online. These guys are sort of rock stars now because trauma's got weirdly big. But I'm at least glad that people are becoming aware of this stuff. You know, 10 years ago, no one knew what it was, and now it feels like it's coming to the public domain. Certainly important to know at least the basics as a trainer. You don't have to be a therapist, but at least be trauma aware, not trauma treating. Know some of these basics. If you work with the body, it is particularly important.